There's a moment most people recognize that realization that you're still in something that isn't working anymore. It might be a job, a relationship, an investment, or a long-standing habit. You can feel it. The energy is gone, the return isn't there, and you know you wouldn't choose this again, not today. And yet, walking away feels wrong. Not because you're confused, but because you've already put so much into it. You've traded time, effort, sacrifice, and identity. In this state, leaving doesn't feel like a neutral decision. It feels irresponsible. It feels like disrespecting your past self or admitting that all that effort was simply wasted. Most people think this struggle is about discipline, loyalty, or grit, but it isn't. It's about how the mind misreads past effort and quietly traps intelligent people inside decisions that no longer make sense. When people stay in situations like this, they usually blame themselves. They assume something is wrong with their character rather than their thinking. So we give the struggle familiar moral labels like weakness, inconsistency, or fear of change. Sometimes we even praise the opposite behavior. We admire people who stick it out, who endure, and who don't quit. Persistence is treated as a virtue almost everywhere, at work, in relationships, and in our culture. Walking away is quietly framed as failure even when the evidence has already changed. This is how people lose years, not in dramatic failures, but in quiet extensions of decisions that already stopped paying. This is what makes the trap so powerful. Because staying doesn't feel irrational, it feels responsible, it feels mature, it feels like honoring the effort you already gave. And the longer you stay, the more serious it feels. Not because the decision improves, but because leaving starts to look like a rejection of your past self. This isn't a lack of discipline, it isn't cowardice, and it isn't a moral flaw. Psychology has a name for this error, but the name matters less than the mechanism. Because once you understand how the trap forms, you can see why even intelligent, well-intentioned people walk into it and stay. To understand why this feels so convincing, we have to look at what's actually happening underneath. Not at character or discipline, but at a specific, predictable error in how the mind evaluates past effort and future outcomes. Psychology calls this the sunk cost fallacy. In simple terms, it means we allow costs that are already paid, time, effort, money, or sacrifice, to influence decisions that should be based only on the future. What matters for a decision is what comes next, what a choice will cost from here forward, and what it can still return. But the mind doesn't experience it that way. Instead, it treats past effort as if it were something you still own, something that needs to be protected and justified. The mind treats effort as an asset, even when it no longer has value. This isn't because people are irrational, it's because the mind evolved under very different conditions. For most of human history, effort was a good predictor of payoff. If you invested time into a skill, a relationship, or a path, the world usually rewarded your persistence. So the brain learned a shortcut. Effort already invested means future payoff is more likely. That shortcut works often enough to be useful, but in modern life it misfires. Because some systems change, some environments shift, and some paths stop paying returns, even though the effort was real. Persistence creates value when conditions are stable. Escalation happens when conditions change and effort replaces evidence. At that point, the heuristic becomes a trap. Two other mechanisms quietly reinforce it. The first is loss aversion. Losses feel heavier than equivalent gains. Walking away doesn't feel like choosing a better future, it feels like accepting a loss. And the pain of acknowledging that loss often outweighs the benefit of stopping further damage. The second is mental accounting. The mind keeps separate ledgers. Money is one ledger, time is another. Effort, sacrifice, and reputation go into a special account. Once something is placed there, abandoning it feels like violating an internal rule. Not a rational rule, a moral one. And then there's motivated reasoning. This is where intelligence starts working against clarity. The mind doesn't ask, is this still the best choice? It asks, how do I explain staying? Evidence is filtered. Doubts are reframed. Countersignals are interpreted as temporary setbacks. The reasoning engine becomes a justification engine. And once effort becomes identity, evidence loses authority. At that point, staying doesn't feel like a decision anymore. It feels like continuity. It feels like responsibility, like being the kind of person who doesn't waste what they've already given. That's how the trap forms, not through poor logic, but through a predictive system doing what it evolved to do in a world where its assumptions no longer hold. Once this mechanism is in place, it doesn't stay confined to one kind of decision. It shows up wherever past effort can be mistaken for future value. What's striking about this error is not where it appears, but how consistently it takes the same shape. Change the domain and the story sounds different, but the structure underneath never does. In careers, it sounds like, I've already put years into this, not years of growth, years of effort, years that now feel too heavy to abandon. In relationships, it becomes, after everything we've been through, shared history turns into a kind of debt, one that makes staying feel honorable even when the present no longer works. In investments, it shows up as, if I sell now, it becomes real. The loss hasn't happened yet. As long as the position stays open, the past still feels salvageable. And in personal identity, it goes even deeper. This is who I am. Walking away doesn't just feel like changing a plan, it feels like dismantling a self-story. Different domains, same internal sequence. First, there is a commitment that makes sense at the time. Then conditions change, slowly or suddenly. Returns diminish and signals shift. But instead of updating the decision, the mind updates the meaning of staying. Past effort becomes proof of seriousness. Continuing becomes a sign of character. Leaving becomes reinterpreted as failure, not of the situation, but of the self. At that point, the domain almost doesn't matter anymore. The brain is no longer evaluating outcomes, it's defending continuity. What looks like persistence from the outside is often just effort being treated as an asset long after its value has expired. And because this process feels responsible, even mature, it rarely triggers alarm. There's no drama, no obvious mistake, just a quiet extension of yesterday's logic into a future where it no longer applies. That's why this trap is so difficult to notice, not because it's rare, but because it hides inside behaviors we're taught to admire. This pattern isn't limited to personal decisions. When the same mechanism operates at scale, among experts, institutions, and governments, its consequences become much easier to see. One of the clearest large-scale examples is the Concorde. The Concorde was an ambitious joint project between Britain and France, a supersonic passenger jet designed to fly faster than the speed of sound. From an engineering standpoint, it was extraordinary. From an economic standpoint, it was a failure. Operating costs were enormous, ticket prices limited demand, and fuel efficiency was poor. By the time the evidence was clear, experts already knew the program would never be commercially viable. And yet funding continued, not because decision-makers were ignorant or lacked data. They were some of the most capable engineers and policymakers of their time. What kept the project alive was not future value, but past investment. Billions had already been spent. Years of labor had already gone in. National prestige was attached to the outcome. Walking away no longer felt like a neutral correction. It felt like admitting that all of that brilliance had been wasted. Each additional decision made sense locally. Just a little more funding, just enough to justify what's already been built. But globally, the logic had flipped. The question was no longer, does this make sense going forward? It had quietly become, how do we avoid turning past effort into a visible loss? This is the sunk cost mechanism at scale. Past investment was treated as an asset that still needed protecting. Prestige replaced payoff. Identity replaced outcome. Because the people involved were highly intelligent, the justifications became sophisticated. Economic, strategic, and political arguments, each one coherent and plausible, extended a decision that no longer made sense. The Concorde shows how sunk costs don't require bad thinking. They require committed thinking in a changing environment. And once effort, expertise, and identity are deeply invested, even the smartest systems struggle to let go. This raises an uncomfortable question. If expertise and intelligence weren't enough to prevent this trap at scale, what does that say about how intelligence actually works in these situations? It's tempting to assume that intelligence protects people from this kind of error. In reality, it often does the opposite. Not because intelligent people think less clearly, but because they think more coherently. Intelligence is very good at building explanations and connecting dots to make decisions feel internally consistent. When a situation starts to fail, a highly intelligent mind doesn't freeze. It works. It generates reasons. It reframes setbacks. It constructs narratives where staying still makes sense. This is where intelligence quietly increases vulnerability. The more effort someone has invested, the more their identity becomes tied to the choice. And the smarter you are, the more convincing your justifications become, not just to others, but to yourself. Intelligence turns discomfort into explanation. It turns warning signs into things that will work out with time. This doesn't feel like denial, it feels like responsibility. There's also a hidden asymmetry at work. High-ability people are often rewarded because they persist and push through complexity. That success history trains a dangerous reflex. If something is failing, I just haven't worked on it enough yet. So when evidence shifts, intelligence doesn't step back, it doubles down with better language and better stories. At that point, the trap no longer looks like a mistake, it looks like maturity. This is where the sunk cost problem starts becoming something more dangerous, because the real damage isn't what gets wasted, it's what quietly disappears while you stay. Most people think sunk costs are about loss, but the deeper problem is irreversibility. Time is not a renewable resource. Attention is not endlessly elastic. Energy does not replenish on demand. When a sunk cost trap holds you in place, it quietly consumes what could still be used elsewhere. Opportunities don't disappear dramatically, they narrow. Health degrades slowly, reputation becomes harder to reset, and skills age in place instead of transferring. Because this erosion happens gradually, it rarely triggers alarm. Nothing is obviously wrong enough to justify leaving, so staying becomes the default. This is the real danger. Not staying too long, but staying long enough that leaving itself becomes risky. The exit costs rise, the alternatives thin out, and the margin for error shrinks. What began as a reasonable commitment transforms into a fragile position where any change threatens stability. This is why sunk costs are not just inefficient, they are option-destroying. They remove future choices one by one without announcing that they're doing it. And by the time the damage is visible, it's often framed as fate or bad luck. But structurally, it began much earlier, at the moment past effort was allowed to outweigh future reality. That's the kind of error protective wisdom is concerned with. Not because it looks dramatic, but because it quietly closes doors while convincing you that staying put is the responsible choice. And once options begin to narrow, the mind doesn't respond by stepping back. It usually responds by committing harder. When a sunk cost trap tightens, the response is escalation. The logic feels simple. If I've already invested this much, stopping now would make it meaningless. But each additional investment changes the psychology. What was once a decision becomes a defense. Every sacrifice raises the emotional cost of leaving. Feedback starts to distort. Warning signs become tests of character. Doubt becomes disloyalty. At this point, the decision is no longer evaluated on outcomes, it's evaluated on meaning. Leaving doesn't just feel costly, it feels wrong. That's the second-order danger. The trap doesn't tighten because people ignore evidence, it tightens because evidence is forced to compete with identity. By the time the costs become undeniable, the system is no longer flexible, it's brittle. And when a system becomes brittle, the danger is that it stops being questioned. At this point, the most useful move is not action, but restraint. Not forcing a decision or rushing an exit, but creating enough distance to see the decision clearly again. That begins with questions, not answers. Questions that simply interrupt the story. For example, what am I protecting by staying my future or my past? If this situation were starting today with no history attached, would I still choose it? What cost am I refusing to see because it's already been paid? These questions don't tell you what to do. They don't imply that staying is wrong or that leaving is right. They exist to separate effort from evidence, to loosen the grip of identity on judgment, to remind the mind that continuity is not the same thing as value. Sometimes clarity comes quickly, sometimes it doesn't come at all, but even when nothing changes outwardly, the internal framing shifts, and that shift matters. Because a decision that is seen clearly no longer needs to be defended blindly. This isn't a video about quitting, and it isn't a video about pushing through. It's about how thinking changes when effort becomes emotionally expensive. Smart people don't get trapped because they lack discipline. They get trapped because the mind is built to protect what it has already paid for. The work here isn't courage or motivation. It's clarity. Seeing when persistence is still creating value and when it's only preserving a story. That's what practical intelligence is for. Not to tell you what to choose, but to help you see what you're actually choosing. Your journey toward practical wisdom begins with clarity, and I'm honored to walk that path with you. Together, we're building a world where wisdom is practical, accessible, and deeply human. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it, and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching. And as always, think deeply, live wisely,